The courtroom fell silent as the homeless man stood, his shabby coat draped over his thin frame. His name was Marcus Johnson, a familiar face to the downtown streets. Today, he was nothing more than a pitiful figure to the judge seated above him, a man in power who clearly had no patience for the likes of Marcus. "Do you even understand the charges against you?" Judge Caldwell barked, his gavel clutched tightly in his hand. The air was thick with disdain. Marcus, with calm defiance, took a step forward. "Yes, Your Honor." "I understand the charges," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. The judge leaned back, an amused smirk playing on his face. "You're charged with trespassing and disturbing the peace. Tell me, Mr. Johnson, do you even know what those mean?" Marcus locked eyes with the judge. "I know what they mean, sir. Just like I know that your actions today are violating my constitutional rights." The judge chuckled dismissively, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, really? And what do you know about the Constitution?" Marcus inhaled deeply, his gaze steady. Then, with startling clarity, he began reciting the United States Constitution, word for word, article by article. His voice carried a strength that filled the room. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Spectators whispered among themselves. The prosecutor dropped his pen, staring in disbelief. Judge Caldwell's face, previously painted with mockery, froze. His gavel slipped from his grip, clattering against the desk. Marcus finished, his voice steady until the last word. "And that's why I have the right to be here, sir." He stared up at the judge, who now looked like a man stripped of his armor. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then the judge leaned forward, gripping the edge of his bench. His face darkened, his lips pressed into a thin line. What do you think you're trying to prove, Mr. Johnson?" the judge asked, but his voice was quieter this time, lacking its earlier authority. Marcus opened his mouth to respond when a loud bang startled everyone. The door to the courtroom slammed open. Two police officers stormed in, their eyes locked on Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, you're coming with us," one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus turned slowly, his jaw tightening. "Why?" he asked. "What did I do this time?" 3 months earlier, Marcus Johnson sat on a cold pavement outside the 7-Eleven on 5th Street, his cardboard sign resting at his feet. The words, "homeless but human," were scrawled across it in fading black ink. Most people passed him by, barely sparing a glance. It wasn't always this way. Once, he'd had a home, a family, and a job. Now he spent his days counting pennies and trying to stay warm. That day, however, something different happened. A man in a suit stopped in front of him, his expression a mixture of curiosity and pity. "What's your story?" the man asked, crouching down to meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus shrugged. "Same as anyone else who's out here, I guess. Lost everything when the factory shut down. Wife left. Couldn't keep up with rent." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You ever think about turning your situation around?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Think about it every day. But it's hard when people look at you like you're trash." The man hesitated, then pulled out a business card. "Name's Trevor Barnes. I work for a nonprofit downtown. We help people like you find jobs and housing. If you're serious about getting back on your feet, call me." Marcus stared at the card, then at Trevor. It felt like a lifeline, one he hadn't seen coming. But before he could say anything, a cop approached, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Move along," the officer said, glaring at Marcus. "You can't sit here." Trevor frowned. "He's not hurting anyone." The officer ignored him. "I said move." Marcus sighed, gathering his belongings. "Thanks for the card," he muttered, shuffling away. He could feel Trevor's eyes on his back as he left. Weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in front of a government building, clutching the business card like a talisman. He decided to give Trevor a call. The man had arranged for him to meet someone who could help, a lawyer named Sarah Miller. Sarah was young, sharp, and full of fire. She listened as Marcus told his story, nodding intently. "You have rights, Marcus," she said firmly. "You may not have a home, but that doesn't mean you're not protected under the law." Marcus smiled faintly. "You think a judge is going to listen to a guy like me?" "They'll have to," Sarah said, "because I'm going to make them." In the courtroom, Sarah argued passionately on Marcus's behalf, but Judge Caldwell was having none of it. "Your client was loitering on private property," the judge said, his voice hard. "The law is clear. Your Honor, Marcus was not causing harm or disturbance, Sarah countered. He was sitting quietly, seeking shelter from the cold. The judge shook his head. I'm not here to debate semantics. The law is the law. And that's when Marcus stood up. He'd had enough. What happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom, and beyond. Marcus rose from his seat, the legs of the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every eye in the room turned toward him, but he wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry either. He was calm, and that made his next move even more unexpected. He spoke clearly, his voice firm but steady. Your Honor, may I say something? Judge Caldwell didn't hide his irritation. Mr. Johnson, sit down. Your lawyer is here to speak for you. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe I have the right to speak for myself, Marcus replied. There was no defiance in his tone, only an unshakable determination. The judge hesitated. He was used to having the final word, and something about Marcus's composure unsettled him. Reluctantly, he gestured for Marcus to proceed. Make it quick. Marcus straightened his posture and began. Your Honor, I may not look like much. I may not live in a house or wear a suit like you do, but I know my rights. I know the Constitution of the United States guarantees me certain freedoms and protections, no matter my circumstances. He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was silent. And since you seem to think I don't understand what those rights are, let me remind you. Then, as he had done earlier, Marcus began to recite the Constitution word for word. The murmurs started as soon as he spoke the preamble. By the time he reached the First Amendment, the room was buzzing. Lawyers leaned over to whisper to each other. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The judge's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. When Marcus finished, he looked directly at Judge Caldwell. This is why I know I have the right to sit where I was, seeking shelter. The law protects me as much as it protects you. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Caldwell's gavel hung loosely in his hand. His lips moved as if searching for a retort, but none came. And then, before anyone could react, the courtroom door flew open again. This time, it wasn't the police. A tall man in an expensive suit strode in, his expression grim. Your Honor, the man said, his voice loud and authoritative. I'm Attorney General David Royce. I need to speak with you about this case. Privately. The judge blinked in surprise. What is the meaning of this? We're in the middle of... With all due respect, Your Honor, Royce interrupted, this is important. Very important. Judge Caldwell, visibly flustered, gestured for a brief recess. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes, he announced, slamming his gavel. As the judge disappeared into chambers with Royce, the tension in the room lingered. Marcus sat down, his face calm, but Sarah leaned over to him, whispering urgently. Marcus, what's going on? She asked. Do you know who that is? Marcus shook his head. No clue. That's the state attorney general, Sarah said. For him to show up here, this is huge. Bigger than I thought. Outside the courtroom, Judge Caldwell stood in his chambers, facing Royce. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Royce crossed his arms. You've been making a spectacle of this case, Your Honor. And it's drawing attention in all the wrong places. I'm enforcing the law, Caldwell snapped. This man broke it. Royce sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. You think the optics of throwing a homeless man in jail are good? Especially one who can quote the Constitution better than you? This is a PR disaster waiting to happen. The judge glared at him. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you think very carefully about how you proceed, Royce said. This case has the potential to explode into something much bigger. And if it does, it won't be your name the public remembers. It'll be mine. Back in the courtroom, Marcus waited, his hands clasped tightly together. Sarah sat beside him, nervously tapping her pen against the table. The recess felt like an eternity. When the judge finally returned, his expression was unreadable. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and looked down at Marcus. Mr. Johnson, he began, while I do not condone your actions, I have been advised to reconsider the approach this court has taken. Marcus frowned slightly, unsure of what that meant. As of now, the charges against you are being dismissed, the judge continued, his tone clipped. However, let this serve as a warning. He didn't get to finish. The courtroom door opened again, and this time it was filled with reporters and cameramen. Flashes erupted, and questions were shouted from all directions. Mr. Johnson, how did you learn the Constitution so well? Do you believe this case was a violation of your rights? Are you planning to sue the city? Marcus froze, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Sarah, sensing his discomfort, stood up and raised her hand. No comment, she said firmly. My client is not taking questions at this time. But even as she ushered Marcus out of the courtroom, the questions followed them. Marcus could hear his name echoing in the hallway. And then, just as they reached the building's exit, a man stepped in front of them. It was Trevor Barnes, the man who had given Marcus his business card months ago. Trevor smiled. Looks like you've got a story to tell, he said. The question is, what do you want to do next? Marcus stared at him, unsure of what to say. But before he could answer, a sharp, angry shout came from behind them. Hey, that man is dangerous. He doesn't deserve this. They turned to see a man pointing at Marcus, his face twisted in fury. The man stormed toward them, and the crowd of reporters quickly parted, their cameras turning to capture the scene. Marcus braced himself, unsure of what was about to happen. The angry man stormed closer, his finger jabbing the air toward Marcus. His voice was loud enough to echo through the corridor. This is a disgrace. You're giving a criminal a free pass, he shouted, his eyes wild with rage. You think quoting some fancy words means he deserves anything? The reporters swarmed around, their cameras and microphones aimed squarely at the commotion. Marcus stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Sarah quickly stepped between him and the man, her arms outstretched protectively. Sir, you need to calm down, she said firmly. Mr. Johnson has done nothing to warrant this kind of behavior. The man sneered. Nothing. He's just another bum, leeching off society. Trevor stepped forward, his expression calm but commanding. That's enough, he said. If you have a problem with a decision, take it up with the judge. Attacking this man isn't going to change anything. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Trevor and Marcus. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, to everyone's shock, he lunged toward Marcus. The reporters gasped, their cameras flashing wildly. Marcus instinctively raised his arms to shield himself, but before the man could reach him, one of the police officers stationed nearby intervened. The officer grabbed the man by the arm and pulled him back with practiced ease. That's enough, sir, the officer said, his tone sharp. You're coming with me. The man struggled, shouting obscenities as the officer dragged him away. The crowd parted to let them pass, their murmurs filling the air. Marcus lowered his arms slowly, his heart pounding. Trevor placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. You okay? Marcus nodded, though his hands trembled. Yeah, I'm fine. Sarah exhaled deeply, her face a mixture of relief and frustration. Let's get out of here, she said. This circus is getting out of hand. As they exited the building, the reporters followed, shouting questions. Marcus tried to ignore them, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. But as they reached the steps outside, a reporter's question stopped him in his tracks. Mr. Johnson, is it true you were once a professor of political science? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus turned slowly, his expression guarded. The reporters quieted, sensing that they'd stumbled onto something big. Trevor glanced at Marcus, his eyebrows raised. Is that true? He asked softly. Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering with an emotion that was hard to place. Finally, he nodded. It was a long time ago, he said quietly. Another lifetime. The reporters erupted, their voices blending into a cacophony of questions. Sarah stepped in front of Marcus again, her hands raised. That's enough, she said. My client has nothing more to say. They managed to make it to Trevor's car without further incident. As the doors closed behind them, the noise of the crowd was muffled, leaving only the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes. Professor of political science? Sarah asked after a moment. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus opened his eyes and shrugged. It didn't seem important. Not anymore. Trevor started the car, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. It might be more important than you think, he said, especially now. Later that evening, Marcus sat in a small room at the nonprofit where Trevor worked. The place was clean and warm, a far cry from the streets he was used to. A plate of food sat untouched on the table in front of him. Trevor entered the room, and pulled up a chair. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "Not much to talk about. I taught political science at a community college for years. Loved it. But when the budget cuts came, my department was one of the first to go. I couldn't find another job in time. Everything fell apart after that." Trevor listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "And you never thought to use that knowledge to get back on your feet?" Marcus shook his head. "It's not that simple. People don't see a man like me and think college professor. They see a bum, someone who doesn't belong." "Well, today you proved them wrong," Trevor said. "That judge looked like he'd seen a ghost when you recited the Constitution. You got something, Marcus. Something most people don't." Marcus looked at him skeptically. "And what's that?" "A story," Trevor said simply. "People love a good story. And yours could change how people think." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could his story really make a difference? Or was it just another thing people would forget as soon as the next big news broke? Before he could answer, the door opened, and Sarah stepped inside. Her face was pale, her expression tense. "We have a problem," she said. "That man from earlier? The one who attacked you. He's pressing charges." Marcus stared at her, his stomach sinking. "What? For what?" Sarah's lips tightened. "He's claiming you provoked him. Says you threatened him before the court session started." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I never even saw him before today." "I know," Sarah said, "but he has a lawyer, and they're pushing hard. We need to figure out how to fight this." Trevor frowned. "This is retaliation. Pure and simple." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But if we can't prove otherwise, Marcus could end up right back in court." Marcus felt a familiar wave of despair wash over him. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, it seemed like the world was determined to keep him down. But then he remembered the courtroom, the look on the judge's face, the murmurs of the crowd, the reporters who'd hung on his every word. Maybe Trevor was right. Maybe his story could make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over yet. Marcus sat in silence, staring at the worn table in Trevor's office. The idea of going back to court churned in his stomach like bad food. He had just started to feel the faintest glimmer of hope, and now it seemed like it could all be snatched away. Trevor leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying him. "Marcus," he said softly, "you don't have to do this alone. We'll fight this." Sarah nodded, her jaw tight with determination. "I'll handle the legal side of things, but we need more than just a defense. We need to get ahead of this." Marcus looked up, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sarah continued, "that this man is painting you as a villain. We need to remind the public of who you really are. The professor, the man who stood up for his rights in court. Not some threat to society." Trevor snapped his fingers. "She's right. Your story is powerful. If we can get it out there, we can shift public perception." Marcus shook his head, anxiety creeping into his voice. "I don't want to be a spectacle. I just want to live my life." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. But right now, they're trying to take even that away from you. If we don't push back, they'll control the narrative." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent years fading into the background, surviving quietly. Was he really ready to step into the spotlight? The next day, Marcus found himself sitting in a brightly lit studio. A small local news station had agreed to air an interview with him, thanks to Trevor's connections. Sarah sat beside him, coaching him on what to say, while the host prepped her notes. "Remember," Sarah whispered, "speak from the heart. Be yourself." Marcus nodded, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. The cameras were intimidating, the bright lights even more so. But as the countdown began, he forced himself to focus. 3, 2, 1 live. The host smiled warmly. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we have a story that's been making waves in our community. Joining us is Marcus Johnson, a man who surprised everyone when he recited the Constitution word for word in a courtroom this week." "Marcus, thank you for being here." Marcus cleared his throat. "Thank you for having me." The host leaned forward, her curiosity genuine. "Let's start with the obvious question. How did you come to know the Constitution so well?" Marcus hesitated, then began. I used to teach political science at a community college. The Constitution was something I taught my students every semester. It was important to me that they understood their rights. The host nodded. And now, years later, you're using that same knowledge to defend yourself in court. That's remarkable. But how did you go from being a professor to living on the streets? The question stung, but Marcus answered honestly. He talked about the budget cuts, the financial struggles, and how his life had unraveled. He spoke about the judgment he faced every day, the way people looked past him like he didn't exist. But he added, I've learned that even when the world tries to erase you, you can still stand up for yourself. That's what I did in court. I'm just a man trying to survive. The host smiled. Your story has touched a lot of people. What do you hope will come of all this? Marcus paused, his gaze steady. I hope people start seeing the humanity in others, no matter their circumstances. And I hope it reminds folks that everyone has rights, even those of us who've lost everything. As the interview wrapped up, Marcus felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. He had bared his soul on live television, and now all he could do was wait and see how the world responded. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. Trevor handed it to him, grinning. You're trending. Marcus squinted at the screen. Social media was flooded with clips from his interview. People were sharing his story, calling him an inspiration. Celebrities were tweeting their support. Even a few politicians had weighed in, using his case to highlight issues of homelessness and inequality. Sarah walked in, holding a stack of newspapers. You're on the front page, she said, setting them down in front of him. Headlines like Homeless Professor Defend His Rights in Court and Constitutional Hero or Criminal screamed back at him. It's not all good, Sarah warned. There are people trying to twist this, saying you're using your past to excuse bad behavior. Marcus sighed. Of course there are. But, she added, the positive coverage outweighs the negative. This is a good start. Trevor nodded. People are paying attention now. That gives us leverage. Marcus frowned. Leverage for what? To fight back, Sarah said. This man pressing charges against you? He's not just some random guy. He's connected. His name is Richard Bowen, and he's a big donor to the judge's campaign. Marcus's eyes widened. What? Are you saying this is all political? Partly, Sarah said. But that also gives us an angle. If we can prove this is retaliation, we can turn the tables. A week later, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, flanked by Sarah and Trevor. A press conference had been arranged to address the charges against him. The steps were packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones aimed at him. Sarah stepped up first, speaking confidently. My client, Marcus Johnson, is being unfairly targeted. This is not about justice. It's about silencing a man who dared to stand up for his rights. But we won't back down. The crowd murmured as Marcus took her place. He gripped the podium, his palms sweaty. But when he spoke, his voice was strong. I never asked for this attention, he began. I didn't want to be in the spotlight. But if sharing my story helps others, then I'll keep speaking out. I may not have a home, but I'm still a citizen of this country. And I will fight for my rights, no matter who tries to take them away. The crowd erupted into applause. Marcus stepped back, his heart racing. But as he turned to leave, a man in the crowd shouted, Watch your back, Johnson. You're messing with the wrong people. The threat was loud and clear, sending a chill down Marcus's spine. Sarah grabbed his arm, her expression grim. We need to be careful, she whispered. This just got a lot more dangerous. Marcus glanced back at the crowd, his jaw tightening. He had come too far to back down now. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The words of the threat echoed in Marcus's mind as he sat in Trevor's office later that evening. Sarah was pacing back and forth, her phone in hand, firing off messages to her legal team. Trevor sat across from Marcus, his arms folded, watching him carefully. You okay? Trevor asked. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm fine. Just thinking about everything. Trevor leaned forward. That was a public threat. Whoever said it wanted you to feel scared. Marcus met his eyes. It worked. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to them. This isn't something we can brush off. I'm going to file a report with the police first thing in the morning. In the meantime, Marcus, you need to be vigilant. Stay close to us and avoid being alone in public. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to defend myself. Now it feels like I've painted a target on my back. Trevor nodded. You're right, you didn't ask for this. But you've struck a nerve, Marcus. People are talking about things they've ignored for too long. Homelessness, inequality, corruption. That's why you're a threat to them. Sarah added, and that's exactly why we can't let them scare you into silence. The next day, the story took another turn. A new video surfaced online, a grainy security camera clip showing Marcus at the 7-Eleven where he'd been accused of trespassing. The footage showed him sitting quietly on the sidewalk, holding his cardboard sign as customers came and went. At no point did he disturb anyone or cause trouble. Sarah burst into the room, her laptop in hand. Look at this, she said, spinning it around to show Marcus and Trevor. This completely dismantles their case against you. Trevor whistled. Where did this come from? A clerk at the store leaked it, Sarah explained. Apparently, they felt bad about what was happening to Marcus and wanted to help. Marcus leaned closer, watching the video play out. A wave of relief washed over him. This proves I wasn't doing anything wrong. Sarah nodded. It does. But it also raises another question. Why were you arrested in the first place? Someone wanted you out of there, Marcus. And we need to find out who. That afternoon, Sarah filed the security footage as evidence and submitted the report about the public threat against Marcus. Meanwhile, Trevor made calls to his connections in local media, ensuring the footage gained traction online. Within hours, it was all anyone could talk about. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, "Exposing the Truth, Marcus Johnson's Arrest in Question," and "Was Marcus Johnson Targeted?" Public opinion shifted even further in Marcus's favor, and the pressure on Judge Caldwell and Richard Bowen began to mount. But the pushback wasn't far behind. Late that night, Marcus woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the bedside table. He groggily picked it up, squinting at the screen. It was a call from an unknown number. "Hello," he answered, his voice thick with sleep. A low voice on the other end replied, "You need to drop this. Stop talking, stop fighting, or you'll regret it." Marcus's heart raced. "Who is this?" The caller didn't answer. Instead, the line went dead. Marcus sat up in bed, his chest heaving. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a court case anymore. This was a fight for his safety, maybe even his life. The next morning, Marcus told Sarah and Trevor about the call. Sarah's face darkened, and Trevor immediately began dialing the police. "This is escalating," Sarah said. "We need to take this seriously." Trevor spoke to the officer on the other end of the line, reporting the call. When he hung up, he turned to Marcus. "They're going to trace the number. Hopefully, it leads to something." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "What if it doesn't? What if this person comes after me anyway?" Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "We won't let that happen. You're not alone in this, Marcus. We're going to protect you." Over the next few days, Marcus was never without company. Sarah insisted on accompanying him to every meeting, and Trevor arranged for extra security at the nonprofit where Marcus was staying. Despite their precautions, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The breaking point came 3 days later. Marcus was walking back to the nonprofit after a late-night interview when he noticed a black car idling at the corner of the street. Its headlights were off, but he could see the faint glow of a cigarette inside the vehicle. His stomach knotted. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder. The car began to crawl forward, its engine barely audible. Marcus turned the corner, his heart pounding, and ducked into an alleyway. He pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. The car rolled past, its windows tinted too dark to see through. He waited until it disappeared around the next corner before stepping back onto the street. When he reached the nonprofit, Trevor was waiting for him at the door. "You're late," Trevor said, frowning. "What happened?" Marcus hesitated, then told him about the car. Trevor's expression hardened. "That's it. We're getting you a safe house. This isn't just a legal fight anymore. Someone's trying to intimidate you." The next day, Sarah and Trevor worked together to move Marcus to a secure location. The apartment was small but comfortable, with reinforced locks on the doors and windows. A security camera was installed at the entrance, and Marcus was given a burner phone for emergencies. Despite the precautions, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He spent his days inside, watching the news and preparing for the upcoming court hearing. The security footage had turned the tide in his favor, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The night before the hearing, a brick crashed through the window of the apartment, shattering glass across the floor. Marcus jolted awake, his heart racing. He rushed to the window and saw the same black car speeding away. Pinned to the brick was a note scrawled in bold, jagged letters. "This is your last warning." Marcus clenched his fists, a mix of fear and anger boiling inside him. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. They wanted to silence him for good. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The days following the brick-through-the-window incident were a blur of heightened security measures, whispered conversations, and constant vigilance. Marcus barely slept, his mind on edge as he waited for the next move from the people trying to scare him into submission. Trevor and Sarah were determined to keep him safe, but even with the increased security, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. By the time the day of the court hearing arrived, Marcus was exhausted but resolute. He had to face his accusers again, but this time he wasn't going to let them control the narrative. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of the small apartment where he was staying, but Marcus barely noticed. His focus was elsewhere. He wasn't just going to fight for his freedom, he was fighting for something bigger, a message that couldn't be ignored. As Trevor drove him to the courthouse, Sarah was on the phone, talking to the media. "We need to get ahead of any negative press," she said. "We're telling the story as it is, not letting them twist it into some criminal conspiracy." Marcus sat in the back seat, his hands clenched together. He'd been through enough at this point to know that the truth didn't always matter. People often believed what they wanted to believe. But today, he had an ace up his sleeve. The courthouse loomed in front of them as they pulled up. A crowd of reporters was gathered outside, snapping photos and shouting questions as Marcus stepped out of the car. For a moment, it felt surreal. He was no longer just a homeless man who had been arrested. He was the face of a cause. Sarah and Trevor moved quickly to shield him from the reporters, guiding him up the steps of the courthouse. Inside, the tension was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the room as they entered the courtroom. Judge Caldwell was already seated, his gavel resting in front of him. And standing beside him, as if ready to deliver another blow, was Richard Bowen. The sight of Bowen sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He could feel the man's eyes on him, cold and calculating. This wasn't just about the case anymore. Bowen had become a symbol of everything that Marcus had fought against: the power, corruption, the inequality. "Mr. Johnson, I trust you're ready for today's proceedings?" Judge Caldwell's voice broke through Marcus's thoughts. His tone was more neutral than it had been the last time they spoke, but it didn't sound like he was any less dismissive. Marcus nodded, standing tall. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." The judge glanced at his papers, then looked up again. "Very well. Let's proceed with the defense. Miss Miller, you may begin." Sarah rose to her feet, her expression calm and collected. "Thank you, Your Honor. Today, we're here not only to address the false charges against my client, but also to expose the corruption that has led us to this moment." She turned toward the jury, her voice steady as she laid out the facts. She presented the security footage from the 7-Eleven, the witness statements, and the proof that Marcus had been unlawfully detained. But she didn't stop there. She turned her attention to the real issue at hand. "We also have new evidence," Sarah said, her gaze moving from the judge to Richard Bowen. "Evidence that shows Mr. Bowen's connection to this case goes far beyond a simple misunderstanding. He's a significant donor to Judge Caldwell's re-election campaign. And that's no coincidence." The room fell silent. Marcus's heart raced as the words hung in the air. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. It was no longer just about proving his innocence. It was about exposing the people who had tried to destroy him for their own gain. Bowen's face turned a shade of red, and he stood up, his fists clenched. "This is absurd," he spat. "I have nothing to do with any of this." Sarah didn't flinch. "The evidence says otherwise. We have financial records showing that you've donated large sums of money to Judge Caldwell's campaign. Donations that could create a conflict of interest in this case. And that's why we're asking for a full investigation into the matter." Judge Caldwell's expression remained unreadable, but Marcus could see the shift in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this. No one was. Mr. Bowen, is this true? The judge asked, his voice colder now. Bowen's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might lash out. Bowen began, but the words faltered on his lips. He looked like a man caught in a trap, realizing that his influence had been exposed. Sarah didn't give him a chance to recover. We also have an anonymous source who's willing to testify that you've been involved in efforts to discredit Marcus Johnson. All of this entire charade, was meant to silence him, to keep him from speaking out. Bowen's face twisted in fury. That's a lie. I have nothing to do with any of this. The judge slammed his gavel down. Enough. Mr. Bowen, you will remain silent until further notice. We will conduct an investigation into these claims. As of now, this case is postponed. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The judge's ruling was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone on him as he stood there, his pulse pounding in his ears. This fight was far from over, but at least for today, they had won. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of reporters was waiting. As Marcus and his team emerged, cameras flashed in every direction. The questions came fast and loud. Mr. Johnson, how does it feel to have your charges dismissed? What do you think about the judge's decision to postpone the case? Do you believe there will be an investigation into Richard Bowen's actions? Marcus held his head high, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. But Sarah stepped forward first, taking the lead. This is only the beginning. We will continue to fight for justice. We will not rest until the truth comes out. Marcus nodded, his voice steady as he addressed the reporters. Today, it's about more than just me. It's about exposing the system that's been broken for far too long. If my story can help people see that, then I'll keep speaking. The questions kept coming, but Marcus stayed focused. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, he felt a small sense of victory. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might just have a chance. Later that evening, Sarah and Trevor sat with Marcus in the small apartment they had set up for him. The news was buzzing with the results of the hearing, and the pressure on Bowen and Judge Caldwell was mounting. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of the battle lift, even if just a little. We did it, Trevor said, his voice filled with disbelief. We actually did it. Sarah smiled, but there was no triumph in her expression. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus looked at them both, his gaze steady. I know. But for now, I'm going to enjoy this moment. Tomorrow, we fight again. As they sat there, watching the news reports, Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. He reached for it and froze when he saw the message. It was from an unknown number. The message was simple. You're still not safe. A cold shiver ran down Marcus's spine. The game was far from over. Marcus stared at the message, his hand trembling. The words glowed ominously on the phone screen. You're still not safe. He felt his chest tighten, a mix of fear and anger welling up inside him. Sarah noticed his change in demeanor and leaned closer. What is it? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. Marcus turned the screen toward her. Trevor peered over her shoulder, his face darkening as he read the text. Damn it, Trevor muttered. They're not letting up. Sarah snatched the phone, studying the message. I'll report this first thing in the morning, she said. But this is escalating. Whoever's behind this isn't just trying to intimidate you. They're trying to break you. Marcus rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling to the surface. Why? What do they want from me? I'm just a guy trying to survive. Trevor placed a hand on his shoulder. You're more than that now, Marcus. You're a symbol, whether you want to be or not. That scares people like Bowen. They're used to controlling the narrative, and you're flipping it on its head. Sarah nodded. But symbols also make you a target. We need to take this seriously. From now on, you don't go anywhere without one of us. No exceptions. Marcus exhaled, nodding reluctantly. He hated feeling like a prisoner in his own life, but he knew they were right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the fight he had inadvertently become the face of. The next morning, Sarah reported the message to the police. They promised to investigate, but Marcus could tell by the look on her face when she returned that their response hadn't been reassuring. They're looking into it, Sarah said with a sigh. Which means we're basically on our own. Trevor crossed his arms. Then we'll handle it ourselves. Marcus, We need to think strategically. If they're trying to intimidate you, it's because they think they can. We need to show them that you're not backing down. Marcus frowned. How? Trevor's eyes lit up. We go bigger. More interviews, more press. We take this story national. If they're going to target you, we'll make sure the whole country is watching. Sarah hesitated. That's a risk. The more exposure we give Marcus, the more danger he could be in. It's also his best protection, Trevor countered. They won't try anything too obvious if they know the world is watching. Marcus listened silently, weighing their words. He had spent so long trying to stay invisible, and now they were asking him to do the exact opposite. But deep down, he knew Trevor was right. Visibility might be the only thing keeping him safe. Let's do it, Marcus said finally. If they want to come after me, I'll make sure everyone sees who they really are. Within days, Marcus's story exploded onto the national stage. Major news outlets picked up the coverage, and Marcus found himself sitting for interviews with some of the biggest names in media. He spoke about his life, his struggles, and his fight for justice, always circling back to the larger issues at play: homelessness, corruption, and inequality. The public response was overwhelming. Support poured in from all over the country. People shared their own stories of hardship and perseverance, inspired by Marcus's courage. Advocacy groups reached out, offering resources and platforms to amplify his voice. Even politicians began to take notice, with some using Marcus's story as a rallying cry for reform. But the attention also brought new challenges. The threats continued, more frequent and more pointed. Sarah and Trevor worked tirelessly to protect Marcus, but the pressure was taking its toll. One evening, Marcus returned to the apartment after a particularly grueling interview. As he unlocked the door, he noticed something strange. The lock felt loose, as if it had been tampered with. His heart raced as he pushed the door open cautiously. The apartment was in shambles. Papers were scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, and the window he thought had been secured was wide open. He froze in the doorway, his mind racing. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare him, they were sending a clear message. Trevor arrived moments later, his face pale, as he took in the scene. "Marcus, are you okay? Were you here when this happened?" "No," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I just got back." Sarah was right behind him, her phone already in hand as she called the police. "This is beyond intimidation," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They're escalating." As they waited for the police to arrive, Marcus noticed something on the table. It was a photo of him, taken during one of his interviews. Across the image, someone had scrawled in red ink, "Last warning." The police arrived and conducted a thorough sweep of the apartment, but as expected, they found no usable evidence. The officers took their report and promised to increase patrols in the area, but their assurances felt hollow. Marcus knew they were outmatched. That night, as he sat in the wreckage of what had been his sanctuary, Marcus made a decision. He turned to Sarah and Trevor, his expression resolute. "I'm not running," he said. "Whoever's doing this wants me to disappear. I'm not giving them that satisfaction." Sarah frowned. "Marcus, you can't fight this alone. We need to find out who's behind it and expose them." Trevor nodded. "She's right, and I think I know where to start." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Where?" Trevor leaned in, his voice low. "Bowen's financial records. If we can connect him to these threats, it'll blow this whole thing wide open." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's a dangerous move, Trevor. If Bowen finds out we're digging into his finances, he'll come after us harder." Trevor shrugged. "He's already coming after us. Might as well hit back." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't want to put Sarah and Trevor in more danger, but he also knew they couldn't keep playing defense forever. "Do it," Marcus said finally. "If we can't expose Bowen, maybe we can end this." The next day, Trevor called in a favor from an old friend who worked in cybersecurity. They began combing through public records, looking for any connections between Bowen and the threats against Marcus. What they found was shocking. Bowen had a history of using his wealth to silence critics and manipulate legal outcomes. Payments to private investigators, donations to judges, and even ties to known enforcers. Bowen's network was vast and well-oiled. "This is bigger than we thought," Trevor said as he sifted through the data. "Bowen isn't just some wealthy donor. He's running a full-blown operation." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her face grim. If we go public with this, it'll be a war. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. Then we'd better make sure we're ready. That night, as they prepared to release their findings, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Marcus froze, exchanging a wary glance with Sarah and Trevor. Trevor moved cautiously to the door, peeking through the peephole. His face went pale. "It's the police," he whispered. "And they don't look friendly." Marcus's stomach dropped. What do they want? Before Trevor could answer, the officers pounded on the door again. "Open up. We have a warrant for Marcus Johnson." The three of them stared at each other, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Marcus's mind raced. What was the warrant for? How far would Bowen go to silence him? Trevor took a step back from the door, his expression tense. "Marcus, we're out of time." The door rattled as the officers prepared to break it down. Marcus stood frozen, knowing this could be the moment everything changed, for better or worse. The door burst open with a thunderous crash, the frame splintering under the force of the officer's battering ram. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding as the police stormed in, guns drawn and voices booming. "Marcus Johnson, put your hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. Trevor raised his hands instinctively, trying to shield Marcus. "Wait, this has to be a mistake," he yelled. "What's the warrant for?" The lead officer stepped forward, a grim expression on his face. "We have evidence connecting Marcus Johnson to an act of vandalism against Richard Bowen's property." "What?" Sarah exclaimed, stepping in front of Marcus. "That's ridiculous. He's been with us the whole time." The officer ignored her. "Mr. Johnson, you're under arrest. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Marcus's mind raced as the officer approached, handcuffs glinting in the harsh light. This was a setup. He knew it, Sarah knew it, Trevor knew it. Bowen was pulling strings again, trying to turn public opinion against him. "I didn't do anything," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "You're arresting the wrong person." The officer hesitated, just for a moment, before gesturing for Marcus to comply. "You can tell your story at the station." "Let's go." Trevor stepped forward, anger etched across his face. "You're making a huge mistake. He didn't vandalize anything. Bowen is lying, and you're playing right into his hands." The officer shot Trevor a warning glare. "Step back, sir, or you'll be joining him." Marcus took a deep breath, his hands raised. He knew fighting back would only make things worse. "It's fine," he said quietly. "Let them take me. I have nothing to hide." Sarah's eyes widened. "Marcus, no. You don't have to go through this." "I do," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "If I run, they win. I won't let them paint me as the bad guy." Reluctantly, Marcus turned and allowed the officer to cuff him. The cold metal bit into his wrists, but he kept his head high as they led him out of the apartment. The ride to the station was tense and silent. Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. He had no idea what kind of evidence Bowen had fabricated, but it was clear this was a coordinated attack. They were trying to discredit him, to paint him as a criminal. But Marcus knew the truth, and he vowed to fight back with everything he had. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was processed and placed in a holding cell. The walls were cold and bare, the air heavy with the stale scent of despair. He sat on the metal bench, staring at the floor, trying to gather his thoughts. Hours passed before Sarah arrived, her expression a mix of anger and determination. She stood on the other side of the bars, gripping them tightly. "They're accusing you of spray painting a threat on Bowen's office building," she said. "Apparently, they have security footage that proves it was you." Marcus frowned. "Security footage? That's impossible. I've been with you and Trevor the whole time." "I know," Sarah said, "and I'm already working on proving that. But they're not just trying to get you arrested, they're trying to ruin your credibility. If people believe you're capable of something like this, everything we've built falls apart." Marcus sighed, leaning back against the cold wall. "What's the plan?" Sarah's eyes burned with determination. "I'm going to challenge the footage. If it's doctored, we'll expose it. And if it's not, well, we'll find out who set you up." Meanwhile, Trevor was busy working behind the scenes. He reached out to his cybersecurity contact, the same one who had helped uncover Bowen's financial ties. Together, they began analyzing the security footage, searching for any signs of manipulation. What they found shocked them. This footage is fake, the analyst said, pointing to the screen. Look at the timestamp. It skips a few seconds right before Marcus's face appears. Someone spliced this together. Trevor's jaw tightened. Can you prove it? Absolutely, the analyst said. I can run a detailed analysis and create a report. This will hold up in court. Trevor nodded. Do it. We need this as soon as possible. Back at the station, Marcus was finally released on bail, thanks to Sarah's relentless efforts. As they stepped outside, reporters swarmed him, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust in his face. Mr. Johnson, do you deny the allegations against you? Were you trying to send a message to Richard Bowen? Do you think this will hurt your public image? Marcus took a deep breath, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. I didn't do what they're accusing me of, he said, his voice steady. This is a distraction, an attempt to silence me and discredit my story. But I won't back down. The truth will come out. Sarah quickly ushered him into a waiting car, the noise of the crowd fading as they drove away. Marcus leaned his head against the window, exhaustion weighing on him. How long do you think they'll keep this up? He asked quietly. Sarah glanced at him, her expression grim. As long as it takes to break you. But they underestimated you, Marcus. You're stronger than they think. That night, Trevor called with good news. We've got the proof, he said. The footage was doctored. We can expose Bowen for this. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. What's the next step? We go public, Trevor said. We hold a press conference, show the world the truth, and make sure Bowen can't wiggle his way out of this. Sarah hesitated. If we do this, Bowen will come at us even harder. Are you ready for that? Marcus nodded, his resolve unshaken. I'm ready. Let's show them who they're messing with. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning. As Marcus stood in front of cameras, flanked by Sarah and Trevor, he felt a strange sense of calm. This was his moment to turn the tables. Trevor presented the evidence, walking the press through the doctored footage and explaining how it had been manipulated. The room buzzed with shock as reporters realized the depth of Bowen's scheme. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. This is what happens when people in power are afraid of losing control, he said. They lie, manipulate, and try to silence those who stand against them. But I won't be silenced. I won't stop fighting, no matter what they throw at me. The room erupted in applause. But as Marcus left the stage, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his stomach dropped. Another message. You've crossed the line. Now it's personal. Marcus stared at the words, his heart pounding. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was about to get even more dangerous. The message stayed burned in Marcus's mind. You've crossed the line. Now it's personal. As the words repeated in his thoughts, he realized this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Whoever was behind these threats wasn't planning to stop. They were escalating. Trevor and Sarah immediately took the message to the authorities. The police promised to investigate, but their assurances felt as hollow as ever. Marcus knew he couldn't rely on them. If he wanted to end this, he'd have to take matters into his own hands, with the help of the people he trusted. That evening, the three of them gathered in Sarah's office. The air was thick with tension as they pieced together everything they knew about Bowen, the threats, and the people working to destroy Marcus. We've already proven Bowen doctored the footage, Sarah said, pacing the room. But that doesn't explain the threats, the break-in, or this latest message. There's someone else involved, someone pulling strings behind the scenes. Trevor nodded. It has to be someone close to Bowen. Someone who knows how to stay in the shadows. Marcus frowned, leaning forward. What about the break-in? They left a photo of me on the table. That's not random. It's personal. Sarah stopped pacing, her brow furrowed. You're right. Whoever did this wants you to know they're watching you. But why? Because they're scared, Trevor said. Marcus, you've become a symbol of everything they're trying to hide. If you win, their whole system starts to crumble. Marcus sighed. Then we need to figure out who they're in fast. Trevor's cybersecurity contact, Eric, joined the effort. He had already uncovered Bowen's financial ties and the doctored footage, but now his focus shifted to tracing the messages Marcus had received. This one's tricky, Eric said, typing furiously on his laptop. Whoever sent these is using burner phones and encrypted networks. They know what they're doing. But can you trace it? Marcus asked, his voice tense. Eric didn't look up. I'll do my best. It's going to take time. Marcus felt a pang of frustration. Time was the one thing he didn't have. The longer this dragged on, the more opportunities his enemies had to strike. The next day, Sarah received an unexpected call. A whistleblower had come forward, an employee from Bowen's company who claimed to have information about the threats against Marcus. The man, who identified himself as Andrew Clark, was nervous and insisted on meeting in a public place. Do you think it's a trap? Trevor asked as they prepared for the meeting. It could be, Sarah admitted. But if he's legit, this could be the break we need. Marcus agreed. If he's risking this to help us, we owe it to him to listen. They met Andrew at a crowded diner on the edge of town. The man was jittery, his eyes darting nervously around the room as he sipped his coffee. Are you Andrew Clark? Sarah asked as they approached. He nodded quickly, gesturing for them to sit. I don't have much time, he said, his voice low. If they find out I'm talking to you. You'll be fine, Sarah said, her tone reassuring. Just tell us what you know. Andrew took a deep breath. I work in Bowen's security team. Well, I used to. I quit last week after things got dark. Bowen's been working with someone to take you down, Marcus. Someone dangerous. Who? Marcus asked, leaning in. Andrew hesitated. I don't know his real name. They call him. He's a fixer, handles problems for people like Bowen. Threats, sabotage, even worse things. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. And you're sure this Red is involved? Andrew nodded. I overheard Bowen talking to him. He's the one who orchestrated the break-in and the threats. Bowen's desperate to get rid of you, and Red's his insurance policy. Trevor frowned. Why are you telling us this? Andrew looked down at his coffee, his hand shaking. Because I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. Bowen's a monster, and Red, he's even worse. You need to be careful. Sarah's expression hardened. Do you have any proof? Anything we can use to expose this? Andrew hesitated again, then slid a USB drive across the table. It's not much, but it's a start. Internal emails, surveillance logs, things that tie Bowen to Red. I hope it helps. Marcus reached for the drive, but before he could take it, the diner door swung open. Two men in dark suits entered, their eyes scanning the room. Andrew's face went pale. They're here, he whispered. Who? Marcus asked. Bowen's men, Andrew said, his voice trembling. They must have followed me. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed the USB drive and slipped it into her bag. We need to leave. No. Trevor nodded. I'll create a diversion. Marcus, you and Sarah get Andrew out of here. No, Andrew said, panic in his voice. If they catch me, I'm dead. They won't, Marcus said firmly. Stick with us. Trevor stood, walking toward the counter and casually knocking over a stack of trays. The loud crash drew the attention of the men in suits, giving Marcus, Sarah, and Andrew just enough time to slip out the back. They hurried through the alley behind the diner, Andrew breathing heavily as he struggled to keep up. Marcus kept a hand on his shoulder, urging him forward. Almost there, Marcus said. Just keep moving. But as they rounded the corner, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. The back doors flew open, and two more men jumped out, blocking their path. Hand him over, one of the men growled, his eyes locked on Andrew. Marcus stepped in front of him, his fists clenched. Not a chance. The man smirked. You think you can stop us? Be smart, Johnson. Walk away. Marcus didn't budge. You want him? You'll have to go through me. The man's smirk faded. Have it your way. He lunged at Marcus, but Marcus dodged, landing a solid punch to his ribs. Chaos erupted as the other man moved to grab Andrew, but Sarah swung her bag, knocking him off balance. Run. Marcus shouted, pushing Andrew toward the opposite end of the alley. Andrew hesitated, fear etched across his face, but Marcus's voice snapped him out of it. He sprinted down the alley, Sarah close behind. Marcus turned back to the men, his body tense as they regrouped. One of them pulled out a weapon, and Marcus's stomach dropped. The fight wasn't just escalating. It had become a matter of life and death. The glint of the weapon in the man's hand froze Marcus for a split second. His instincts screamed at him to move, but his feet felt like they were planted in cement. The man raised the gun, his expression a mix of confidence and cold intent. "You should have walked away, Johnson," the man said, his voice low and steady. A loud crash echoed down the alley. Trevor had reappeared, barreling into the man with full force, sending the gun clattering to the ground. The second man turned toward them, but Marcus reacted quickly, swinging his fist and catching him square in the jaw. The man stumbled, giving Marcus just enough time to grab the discarded weapon and toss it down a nearby storm drain. "Go, go," Trevor shouted, shoving Marcus toward the direction Sarah and Andrew had run. Marcus nodded, his adrenaline surging as he bolted down the alley. He could hear Trevor's footsteps close behind him, as well as the shouts of their pursuers. The narrow space echoed with the sounds of their escape, each noise magnified in Marcus's ears. They emerged onto a busy street, blending into the crowd. Marcus spotted Sarah and Andrew across the road, frantically waving them over. He and Trevor darted through traffic, horns blaring as they narrowly avoided speeding cars. When they reached the other side, Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her face pale but resolute. "We need to disappear." "No." The group ducked into a nearby subway station, descending the stairs two at a time. Trevor kept glancing over his shoulder, watching for any sign of pursuit. They boarded the first train they saw, squeezing into the crowded car as the doors closed behind them. Marcus leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. Andrew sat on the floor, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Andrew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Sarah said bluntly. "But we're not going to stop either. You did the right thing coming to us, Andrew. We'll protect you." Andrew looked up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "You can't protect me from them. They have resources, connections. They'll find me." Marcus knelt beside him, his gaze steady. "We'll find a way. They're not invincible. People like Bowen and Red rely on fear to control others. But we're not afraid." Andrew shook his head. "I am." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's okay. Fear doesn't mean you stop fighting. It means you fight harder." Back at Sarah's office, Eric was waiting with a grim expression. He held up the USB drive Andrew had given them. "I've gone through the data," he said. "There's enough here to link Bowen to Red and to tie both of them to the threats against Marcus. But there's more." Sarah frowned. "More?" Eric nodded. "There's a pattern in the surveillance logs. Red has been keeping tabs on not just Marcus, but anyone close to him. That includes you, Sarah. And you, Trevor." Trevor's jaw tightened. "Of course. They want to know what we're planning." "It gets worse," Eric continued. "There's a file labeled Phase 2. It's encrypted, but based on the metadata. It's a contingency plan. If Bowen and Red's current efforts fail, this plan goes into effect." "What's in it?" Sarah asked. Eric shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I'm working on decrypting it. Whatever it is, it's big." Marcus exhaled, his mind reeling. "We're running out of time." The next day, Sarah arranged for Andrew to be placed in a safe house under an alias. Trevor and Marcus focused on building their case, preparing to release the contents of the USB drive to the media. But tensions were high. Every noise outside the office, every unfamiliar face, felt like a potential threat. Eric finally broke through the encryption on the Phase 2 file late that night. His face was pale as he read the contents, his hands trembling slightly. "You're not going to like this," he said. "What is it?" Marcus asked, leaning over his shoulder. Eric turned the laptop toward them, revealing a detailed document outlining an assassination plan. The target, Marcus Johnson. "They're planning to make it look like an accident," Eric said. "Car crash, maybe, or a random attack. Something no one would question." Sarah's face hardened. "We need to go public with this." "No." Trevor nodded. "Agreed. This isn't just about taking down Bowen anymore. It's about saving Marcus's life." Marcus looked at them, his expression unreadable. "If we do this, we have to make sure they can't spin it. We need irrefutable proof." "We have it," Eric said. "Between the emails, the surveillance logs, and this file, there's no way they can deny it." The press conference was set for the following morning. Security was tight, with armed guards stationed throughout the venue. Reporters packed the room, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every moment. Sarah opened the conference, presenting the evidence piece by piece. She detailed Bowen's connections to Red, the threats against Marcus, and the Phase 2 plan. The room was silent, the gravity of the revelation sinking in. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. "This isn't just about me," he began. "This is about a system that allows people like Bowen and Red to operate unchecked. A system that punishes the vulnerable and protects the powerful. But that system only works if we stay silent. And I refuse to stay silent." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His mind was on the fight still ahead. As they left the venue, Marcus felt a cautious sense of hope. They had taken a major step toward exposing the truth. But as they climbed into the car, his phone buzzed with another message. "This ends tonight." Marcus stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He showed the message to Sarah and Trevor, their faces mirroring his fear. "They're coming," Marcus said quietly. And this time, he knew there was no running. The weight of the message hung in the air. "This ends tonight." Marcus's chest tightened as he locked eyes with Sarah and Trevor. They sat in the car, the glow of streetlights illuminating their tense faces. There was no mistaking the intent behind a message. It was a final warning. "We can't wait for them to make the first move," Trevor said, his voice low but urgent. "We have to act now." Sarah nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll call the police and request immediate protection. This isn't a threat we can ignore." "No," Marcus interjected, his tone resolute. "We've seen how that plays out. Bowen and Red have people everywhere. We need a plan that doesn't rely on anyone else." Trevor frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Marcus exhaled, his mind racing. "We lure them out. If they want to end this tonight, we make sure it ends on our terms." Sarah shook her head, her expression incredulous. "You want to set a trap for them." "Marcus, that's dangerous. These people are killers." "And they're not going to stop," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "This is the only way to expose them. We show the world who they really are." They regrouped at Trevor's office, the tension in the room palpable. Eric joined them via video call, his face grim as he reviewed the latest threat. "I've been tracking their movements," Eric said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Red's men have been circling the area around the press venue. They're watching you, waiting for the right moment." Trevor leaned over Eric's virtual feed. "Can you pinpoint their location?" "Not exactly," Eric replied, "but I can narrow it down to a few blocks. If we create a distraction, we can draw them out." Marcus nodded. "Let's do it." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Marcus, if this goes wrong—" "It won't," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not backing down now." The plan was simple, but risky. Marcus would return to the press venue under the guise of retrieving forgotten documents. Trevor and Sarah would follow discreetly, keeping a safe distance. Eric would monitor everything in real time, tracking any unusual activity in the area. As Marcus stepped out of the car and approached the building, his heart pounded in his chest. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made his skin crawl. He could feel eyes on him, though he couldn't see anyone. He entered the building and moved toward the stage where the press conference had taken place. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency exit signs. He pretended to search through papers on the podium, his ears straining for any sound. Outside, Trevor and Sarah watched from the shadows. Trevor spoke into a small earpiece connected to Eric. "Anything." "Hold on," Eric replied. "I've got movement. 2 vehicles approaching from the west. Looks like SUVs. This could be them." Sarah's jaw tightened. "How close?" 3 blocks, Eric said. "They are moving fast." Trevor cursed under his breath. They're not wasting time. Inside the venue, Marcus heard the faint hum of engines growing louder. He straightened, his senses on high alert. Moments later, the door at the back of the room creaked open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his silhouette backlit by the streetlights outside. Marcus recognized him immediately. "Red." "You've got guts," Red said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll give you that." Marcus squared his shoulders. "If you're here to end this, let's do it." "No more games." Red chuckled, the sound chilling in the empty room. Oh, this isn't a game, Johnson. This is business. And you're bad for business. He gestured, and two more men entered the room, each one holding a firearm. Marcus's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. You think killing me will solve your problems? Marcus asked. People know the truth now. Taking me out won't stop that. Red smirked. Maybe not, but it'll send a message. Outside, Trevor and Sarah saw the SUVs pull up to the building. Four more men stepped out, armed and moving with purpose. They're going in, Sarah whispered, her voice tense. Marcus is outnumbered. Eric's voice came through the earpiece. Hold tight. I've already alerted the authorities. Backup is on the way. Trevor shook his head. They won't get here in time. We have to move now. Inside, Red circled Marcus like a predator stalking its prey. I've dealt with men like you before, he said. Idealists. Fighters. You all think you can change the world. Marcus stood his ground, his voice steady. It's not about changing the world. It's about doing what's right. Red stopped, his smirk fading. What's right doesn't matter in the real world, Johnson. Power does. As Red raised a hand, signaling his men, the sound of shattering glass erupted from above. Trevor and Sarah crashed through the upper-level window, armed with improvised weapons. The distraction was enough for Marcus to act. He lunged at the nearest man, knocking the gun from his hand. Chaos erupted. Trevor swung a metal pipe, taking down one of the men, while Sarah used a fire extinguisher to blind another. Marcus grappled with Red. The two of them locked in a brutal struggle. You think this ends with me? Red growled, his grip tightening around Marcus's arm. You're just a pawn. Maybe, Marcus replied, his voice strained. But even pawns can take down kings. With a surge of strength, Marcus shoved Red backward, sending him crashing into the podium. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The police stormed the building moments later, their weapons drawn. Red's men froze, dropping their weapons as the officers surrounded them. Red glared at Marcus, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. This isn't over, he snarled as the police cuffed him. Marcus stared at him, his chest heaving. It is for you. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Reporters had gathered, capturing the arrests and the aftermath. Marcus, Trevor, and Sarah stood together, bruised but victorious. You did it, Sarah said quietly. You stood your ground. Marcus nodded, a weary smile on his face. We did it. Together. As the police led Red and his men away, Marcus knew the fight wasn't entirely over. There would be more battles to come, more truths to uncover. But for now, he had won a critical victory. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and the overflow crowd spilled into the halls outside. Marcus sat at the defense table, Sarah by his side, while Trevor and Eric sat in the gallery, watching intently. This wasn't just a hearing, it was the culmination of everything they had fought for. Across the room sat Richard Bowen, his usually polished demeanor replaced to the nervous rigidity. Red, flanked by his lawyers, was a stark contrast, his cold, unrepentant stare fixed on Marcus. Today, the court would hear the charges against them both: conspiracy, intimidation, fraud, and attempted murder. The judge entered, and the room fell silent as the proceedings began. Over the next several hours, Sarah presented the evidence with precision and clarity. The USB drive, the doctored security footage, the surveillance logs, and the Phase 2 assassination plan were all laid bare for the court. Witnesses testified, including Andrew Clark, who described in detail the inner workings of Bowen's operation and Red's involvement. Trevor and Eric's digital forensics report sealed the case. They demonstrated how Red had orchestrated the threats and attacks, all funded and sanctioned by Bowen. The courtroom gasped as Eric displayed emails and financial transactions connecting the two men to every attempt to silence Marcus. By the time Sarah rested her case, it was clear Bowen and Red had underestimated Marcus Johnson. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he rose and approached the witness stand. The room fell silent as he looked out at the crowd. He could see the faces of people who had come to support him: activists, fellow survivors of homelessness, and everyday citizens who had been inspired by his courage. I'm not a hero, Marcus began, his voice steady but emotional. I'm just a man who wanted to survive. I didn't ask to become a symbol, and I didn't ask for this fight. But sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. Sometimes you have to stand up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been ignored, silenced, or made to feel like they don't matter. He paused, letting his words sink in. This case isn't just about me. It's about exposing the systems that allow people like Bowen and Red to operate. It's about showing that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, they're not above the law. Marcus turned to the judge. I hope today sends a message, not just to the people in this room, but to everyone watching. The truth matters. Justice matters. And every voice deserves to be heard. The courtroom erupted in applause, the judge banging his gavel to restore order. But even he couldn't hide the faint hint of respect in his expression. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Bowen's face crumpled as the judge read the sentence. 20 years in prison, with no chance of parole. Red, whose crimes included attempted murder, received life behind bars. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus sat quietly, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of a long, grueling journey. Weeks later, Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of supporters. His story had sparked a national conversation about homelessness, corruption, and the power of resilience. Legislation inspired by his fight was already in motion, aiming to provide better protections for the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. Today is not the end, Marcus said, his voice carrying over the crowd. It's the beginning of something bigger. Together, we can build a society where no one is invisible, where everyone has a chance to be heard. The crowd cheered, their applause thunderous. Among them, Marcus spotted familiar faces: Trevor, Sarah, Andrew, and even Eric. They had stood by him through the darkest moments, and now they were celebrating the light they had created together. That evening, Marcus returned to the shelter where he had once sought refuge. He volunteered there now, mentoring others who were struggling to find their way. As he walked through the halls, a young man approached him, holding a worn copy of the U.S. Constitution. "Mr. Johnson," the man said nervously, "I've been reading this. I want to learn more. Will you teach me?" Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Of course. Let's start with the preamble." As he recited the familiar words, his voice steady and clear, Marcus realized something important. He had fought for justice, for truth, and for the right to be seen. But in doing so, he had also reclaimed something he thought he'd lost forever: his purpose. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. He was no longer just a man on the streets. He was a symbol, a fighter, and above all, a teacher, someone who could inspire others to find their voice and change the world, one word at a time.